Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the Mike McNair's Revolutionary Strategy series. We're sorry for being a little bit late starting. We were busy fighting amongst ourselves about the current Venezuela season that's going on at the moment. All the shenanigans going on with Maduro, etc., etc. So we've got only three of us here today, but it's quality, not quantity. First of all, let's introduce Grant. Grant, how's it going?
Hello, good to be here.
Looking very young and erudite there in his photo. Now, next to Alexi. Alexi, how's it going?
Hey, broadcasting from Arizona, just outside of Phoenix. And yeah, doing a big think about the left and the right of the Marxist strategic spectrum.
Very good, very good. You're there straight in the middle of all those ley lines. Watch out for the aliens. Now, here we're going to do chapter 2 today. Did anybody want to say anything quick about chapter 1 before we go on? Or are we good?
I think what we need to do is just read, what was it, the last paragraph, because we didn't quite get there, and for good reason, because this is actually where McNair sets up the central metric of the whole book, which is the what I like to call it the Marxist strategic spectrum. I don't know if he ever gives it a name. And yeah, so this is the left, center, and right positions that we're going to be using throughout the whole podcast series, essentially. So, you know, boys, girls, and everyone in between, get your notepads out. This is the, I think we should just read this paragraph.
Here, okay. Yeah, there's 3 hypotheses for the socialist movement.
Okay, just give me a second and I'll share it to the screen here. One sec.
Sure.
Share.
No, did you post to your Facebook page, Tom?
I did.
Okay.
So we have a few people in the chat in already. I don't know if there's chat action yet, but no chat action, but we've got 5 watching. So chat action will probably start.
Yes. You're quite right. I saw this. This link is from February 2nd, it looks like. Is that the one? Am I looking at the wrong one?
Just go to my YouTube channel and it'll be there. I don't know.
Okay. YouTube, doesn't look
my Facebook, I just had a picture, but I didn't do a link because people can just get on the YouTube channel.
That's correct. Anyway.
Okay. So here we go. The end of chapter 1. This is TSSI. What the hell? Wrong one. Give me. That's climbing.
It's all right.
I was very confused there. Sorry. I was like, God damn it! I thought we finished with that shit.
Oh, it's never over, as you know.
It is never over. Okay, here we go. This last paragraph here is the one we're going to talk about. Lexi, do you want to take this paragraph here? And this kind of outlines the structure for the coming book and also the argument in the next chapter, the chapter we're going to be doing with today.
Yes. Let's go ahead and read this. One moment. All right, here we go. Around the turn of the 19th and 20th century, we can identify roughly 3 strategic hypotheses in the socialist movement. The right wing is traditionally identified with reference to Edward Bernstein's evolutionary socialism, though it in fact included various forms of pure trade unionist, quote, politics, ethical socialism, and so on. The center can be identified roughly with reference to Karl Kautsky's relatively late The Road to Power. The left can similarly be identified even more roughly and equally on the basis of a late text with Rosa Luxemburg's The Mass Strike, the Political Party, and the Trade Unions. Quote, even more roughly, because Luxemburg's position is in some respects intermediate between the Kautskyites and the core of the left. Both the content of the debate in the Second International and its limitations are essential if we are to understand modern strategic questions rather than merely repeating old errors.
Okay, so he's going to split essentially the strategic choices in 3. On the right, we got I suppose you would call this social democrat right. In the center, you've got Kautsky and the kind of the strategy of patience, but revolutionary. And then on the left, we have the mass strike and Luxembourg. So this is like the three main strategies of the Marxist left, we're saying, because it doesn't include so much the anarchist left. Is that correct?
That's how I see it. He says that these are the strategies of the socialist movement. I think that I like the picture that he paints in I think it's the first chapter where he's delineating Marxism proper, in his opinion. You know, what is political Marxism versus Bakunin on the left and LaSalle on the right, to use the First International as a sort of metric, or a First International as a source for a metric. So I call that like the socialist spectrum, and I call this like the Marxist spectrum, but I'm quite annoying. So I don't think McNair makes that move.
Well, I do think, though, that McNair, I hope at least, that he would agree with you that this isn't the only spectrum in Marxism, that this is a very useful spectrum on electoral strategy, but that it isn't the end all be all. And perhaps I'd even say that the left right language is a bit confusing to it.
Yeah, I think he would he would agree that this isn't the only spectrum. McNair is not a language first thinker. He's coming at this trying to identify these three strategies that reappear in Marxism over and over and over again. And yeah, there are other relevant socialist strategies. There's
and there's Karl Kautsky's metaphysical position in the middle somehow.
Well, Karl Marx, in a way, has a metaphysical position in the middle between LaSalle and Bakunin. And there's a sort of, I don't know, golden mean that you keep seeing in Marxism, where you're constantly trying not to do the two dominant things.
Right. Well, it's kind of like with the anarchists, you're always going to be addressing, these big questions of social totality in these, quote unquote centralizing ways or what have you, and they're not going to like that. And then with your kind of contemporary Leninist, you're not going to be in love with the state enough. And so I feel that
contemporary Leninist isn't an exact parallel for the I see what you're saying.
Right, LaSalle, you know what I mean?
Sorry for interrupting. Just to say that.
No, it's okay. I think that well, I lost my train of thought actually, but that's okay.
I'm a dick. What you were saying is that the contemporary Leninists will also, in the same way that
just that I think as a Marxist on the state, I think you often end up between a rock and a hard place, and that is right. a fun, good position to be in, really.
I think for the purposes of this book, the sort of red-brown alliance types, and the communizers that don't accept any kind of transition alike, those are non-Marxist politics for the purposes of this book. Those are LaSalle and Bakunin for the purposes of this book.
Okay, so we've cleared that up. No, so we're saying basically he's saying in the Second International there was three main strands of strategy: patience, kind of social democratic coalition, and kind of becoming a part of the state, and on the other hand, the general strike, revolutionary, what would you call it, spontaneity of Luxembourg and them,
autonomous model of revolution.
Yeah, and I think
extensionism even.
Who's extensionism now?
It's the what you'll see here is that each of these left, right, center positions each has a vision of how the revolution happens. So that's the link between the autonomist vision of revolution and an abstentionist strategy, for instance, or an evolutionary, a gradualist vision of revolution and a reform coalition strategy. See what I'm saying?
Well, fair enough, but I don't know if the right, you could say, had revolutionary aims.
Well, you have to question the
Mm.
sincerity of it, maybe, but I do believe there were people who thought that the society Marx is describing could be brought about through reforms. I think they were wrong, but
Yeah,
the idea that capitalism could gradually turn into socialism without a fundamental break, I don't think that makes you not a communist. I just think that's incorrect.
I think that's one of the best things about laying it out like this, is that we can accept that there are people that do kind of believe in communism, but have this, frankly, revisionist strategy of getting there. And Bernstein is kind of one of these people. You know what I mean? It is said that he basically abandons all goals of classless society, but I think he's very useful if you want to abandon goals of classless society. But I don't think he did. And
Well,
over time, yes.
Sorry, no, I was going to say to you, like, how many of these people do you think that tack towards the reformist points of view actually today in our society
Very
are
few.
Revolutionary?
Towards the economy?
I think fewer. I think fewer than then. I think that one of the reasons you could have a kind of right-wing Marxism was those kind of tethers to a real mass movement that existed at the time, would do some kind of work on the intellectual things being produced.
Tom's getting at something interesting here that I've been thinking about for a while. A right Marxist position, as spelled out as being like derived from the Second International here, tends to collapse into the abandonment of the idea of classless society, and it sort of retains this sort of like idea of workers' politics, but in general, yeah, there is a drift from this right Marxist position to like a, I don't know, an ultra right Marxist position, maybe, if we're going to be charitable. And the thing I'd say about that is that there's a parallel move on the left. Like if you're an abstentionist, there's this text. I'm sorry. There's a text by Otto Ruhl, one of these like German left comms. I think he kind of flirted with national unity at the wrong time, so he's marked with the Nazi friendly brush a little bit. But he wrote a pamphlet called "The Revolution is Not a Party Affair," where he basically argues that if you're an abstentionist, there's no point in having a party. So there's a parallel move from like a left Marxist position to what you might call an ultra left Marxist position. But anyway, I've been staring at this chapter for far too long.
It just strikes me that when we think about, say, the people that I know in my own life, or the people who I follow politically, not because I agree with them, but I just follow them, say, and that are, say, of the right of this, what we're going to talk about today. I think that the vast majority of those in today's world aren't revolutionary socialists. The vast majority are kind of lefty careerists. That's how I would describe them.
Yeah.
And I expect most of them to drift further right as they get older. And it just seems to me that there is the case, you can make a case that the reform way could be a step to revolution. But I do think that it, by definition, will attract all of the worst, most right drifting Marxists.
I mean,
both then and now.
I would, though, add that feeling of, when I look at this really closely, I'm not sure these people are revolutionary socialists. I think you can find that across this spectrum in people who are far left as well. I think that there is, like Lexi was saying, the kind of communization, abandonment of activity altogether. Or in general, I think that you can be non-revolutionary, or you can be non-revolutionary in the way you were expressing, Tom, and be aligned with any of these three revolutionary strategies. Like that people on the far left can be just as opportunistic, that people in the Marxist center, people who hold to a McNair line on, because McNair's line is ultimately that you can govern, you can enter the political sphere antagonistically and have a troll party. And I mean, he says more than that, I guess, but that
My line on it.
That basically, I think that you could have that position and be a good Marxist, and you could also have that position and be a bad Marxist. And that applies to maybe all three of these, less so to being a reformist, but there's some ideological blurring that I think happens that the left-right language here also makes confusing.
Well, the thing that I'd like to say is that the reason that it's necessary to make this argument is that historically, the dominant Marxist tradition agrees. What right Marxism? Get the fuck out of here. You're not. All of you are not communists. We are splitting from you. Sort of the meaning of Lenin, or what one would hope Lenin could mean. Like in general, is that look, we're splitting from this corrupt, parasitic, nationalist, loyalist right. They are not sincere communists. They could never be. But the problem is that you sort of cut yourself off from the truth about the Marxist tradition. The truth about the Marxist tradition is that because of Marx and Engels' theory of the state, they tended to see democratic republics, the ones that, Grant and I are living in right now, or even in the UK. It's not even really a democratic republic, but like a constitutional monarchy. And Marx and Engels were open to the idea that this, a communist economic revolution could happen peacefully in these places. So there's a theoretical lineage going back to Marx and Engels that is defensible, even if it seems historically absurd. That in order to just put it all on paper, I don't think it's too useful to block these people out of Marxism. I think it's more useful to make your appeal to them by including them, but just spelling out the fine point details of why they're wrong and why, how this is going to lead away from communist revolution.
Fair enough. Like, I agree that you can get the worst types in all different strands, but I just feel like you find most of I think you will find a lot of people in this that would gravitate to this. These are the same people that gravitate to the Labour Party in England. Your Jack Straws and Tony Blairs, who are Trotskyists for a while, and then they find they can really easily go to. Actually, maybe I'm not being coherent, but I feel like there's a predominant amount of people in this right socialist or a right Marxist strand, more so than the others, will tend to move to the right. Anyway, we're kind of saying the same thing again and again. Will we start? Well, let me just read this.
Wait, there's one more thing that's before this that I think is sort of relevant that McNair acknowledges, that it's the last paragraph on the first page, on page 38, that let's see. I'm just going to read this. These tendencies drew on debates which had already begun. The general strike strategy of the left was a variant form of positions which had already been argued by the Bakuninists in the 1870s and were still maintained by anarcho-syndicalists. The policy of the right had indirect roots in the Lassalleans' policy of demanding that the German imperial state support the workers against the capitalists. Its more immediate root was the successful coalition policy of SPD regional leaders in southern Germany, which Engels criticized in The Peasant Question in France and Germany. So, it's not even that, these Marxist positions tend to drift towards their non-Marxist variants. That's where they're from.
Okay, let's have a go at reading what is the right Reform versus utopianism. The underlying common idea of the right wing of the movement was that the practical task of the movement was to fight for reforms in the interests of the working class. In order to win these reforms, it was necessary to make coalitions with other tendencies which were willing to ally with the workers' movement. And in order to make coalitions, it was necessary in the first place to be willing to take governmental office. It was by creating a coalition government that the possibility really arose of legislating in the interests of the working class, as well as administrative measures, creating social security systems, etc. Secondly, it was necessary to be willing to make substantial political compromises. Thus, Engels in The Peasant Question polemicized against Volmar's programmatic concessions to the peasantry in relation to positive subsidies for family farming and in relation to trade union issues affecting agricultural labourers employed by small farmers. Okay, so he's basically here saying that if you want to actually make change in society that'll benefit the left, you got to enter government. And if you enter government, you're going to have to compromise. Okay.
Yeah. And I think the most devastating consequence of this is the next paragraph.
Yeah. So the largest compromise, but from the point of the view of the right, the smallest, would be for the Workers' Party to abandon its illusory and futile revolutionism. And with it, equally illusory Marxist claims about crisis and the notion that an economic downswing, reforms as concessions made to the working class would tend to be taken back unless the working class took political power into its own hand. Okay, so like if you go for coalition and you go for government, you're becoming a part you become a part of the establishment in essence. And you have to
and when that economy swings back down, you're going to become the new hated administrators of capital.
Exactly. And it's inevitable, capitalism is crisis, fallen rate of profit, blah, blah, blah. It's going to happen.
Right. But he makes a note of this because he's very thorough, isn't he? In the second to last paragraph of this section, he points out that, especially in the form that Bernstein packages it in, that this usually comes with a larger critique of Marxist theory, because you're right. If you believe in Marxist economics, if you think that's a description of capitalism, this couldn't possibly work, right? Because you would take responsibility for a government that would go into crisis and yada yada, for all the reasons Tom said. But if you think the scientific approach of Marx and Engels was, as he says here, it was diverted by the residual Hegelianism, and that you need to, make some adjustments to their predictions and to their theories. And at the time, if you were in Germany, I think Max Weber wrote about this, that, it seems like Marx was wrong about these predictions. Perfectly sincere scientific socialists were starting to question whether the trends that he was predicting wouldn't pan out in that doom and gloom way, and maybe capitalism was more stable than he thought. There was a similar wave in the time that we were born in. But anyway, yeah, so that's what makes
this paragraph. Which paragraph would you want to read? Did you want to read this paragraph?
Oh,
or you just...
yeah, I can read it.
No, you don't have to. No.
Okay.
I actually really like the one above it too. If you
okay.
look at the one above it,
Grant, why don't you
makes interesting claims though. Actually, it makes different claims. So Lexi, if you had a point, you can.
Just that.
No.
Right-wing Marxism comes with a package of a critique of Marxism. This is actually a lot of where the beginnings of the critique of Hegelianism in Marxism come from, which is why a lot of people are just suspicious of any critique of Hegelianism.
Right. I think that here too, this is really interesting about the state. The claim that economic downswing would produce a tax on concessions already made could be perfectly well conceded by rightists as true of the bourgeoisie. But the argument that this was also true of the state depended on the claim that the state was a class instrument in the hands of the bourgeoisie and was thus intertwined with revolutionism. So I think we are kind of doubling back there in me quoting that. I'm sorry, but it just seems like really interesting to say that that you can't just take the state administration as is, that it is a bourgeois relation in a certain sense, not just a a neutral party controlled by the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, I think that's important. Like, he makes the distinction there between, it's not like you get control of the state and the economic relations don't matter. It's just politics. No, it's fundamentally economics first. That's what we should be thinking about as materialists. And it's not like you can control the state and you can defend the working class in the times of crisis, maybe to some extent, but you're also going to be the one that's going to drive them down at the same time. It's like it's you know, it's inevitable.
Right, you're becoming a part of the political management of the mode of production, and that is about continuing the stability of that mode of production, and the market being, the market recovery is when you're making government reform, you're not going to be legislating on behalf of the working class.
Okay, now as we go through the book, McNair always breaks things up into the positive and negative claim. Lexi,
oh yeah, I love that shit.
has an orgasm every time
it's true.
she mentions this. So let's have a look here about what the positive. So the positive claim is essentially that programmatic concessions can win real reforms, and the negative is that their negative claim is revolution is unrealistic, worthless, and illusory. Okay. Yeah. So let's have a look. So the right's positive claim, but how they can go and get reforms and make the working class life a bit better. And that's the way you should go about it. I like this little bit here. He talked about the British Labour Party after 1945. Let me just read this one. It may then, like the British Labour Party after 1945, become a party which is in form a workers' party capable of forming a government on its own. But it is in reality, in itself, a coalition between advocates of the independent political representation of the working class on the one hand, and liberal or nationalist state reformers and political careerists on the other. To use Lenin's very slippery expression, a bourgeois workers' party. And I think that's the story of the 20th century in Europe. Yep. These type of parties.
Straight up and down. McNair argues that the SPD from its roots was one of these.
Does he?
So, yes. And he says essentially that the split, the split away from the Second International was justified on precisely this basis. He does take that from Lenin.
I thought that I didn't get that. Like, was Kautsky not?
Kautsky was not pro.
Was SPD not like basically the party of Kautsky and that strategy?
Well, he has a critique of the historical center that has a lot of teeth and is inspired a lot by the 1914 through 1918 Lenin, when he was lined up with Luxemburg and Pannekoek and Karl Radek.
Sorry. Can you say that again for me, Lexi? Because I was just looking at the chat for a second.
Oh, sure. Yeah. McNair is super influenced by the 1914 through 1918 Lenin, when he's lined up with Luxemburg and Karl Radek and Anton Pannekoek, where they're disgusted by the way that the SPD capitulated in World War I. And are sort of like, no, they have to break from that. I think Luxemburg calls it a stinking corpse of social democracy, in order to have a real communist politic. That is where people start using the distinction of communist as opposed to socialist again, which isn't the first time that happens in Marxist history.
So I have a question for you then. Like, was it not the case that the party SPD had basically, they weren't radical enough to say no to the empire, the imperial war, that the base they couldn't carry the base?
I You know, the actual historical ins and outs, probably not the person to ask. But as far as McNair goes, and I think he states this towards the beginning, I think he stated in the last chapter, he's talking about the German SPDs and later the Second International's prioritizing of unity of the movement above all else, right? And he will go on to argue that this gives the right wing a de facto veto on just about anything because it's more powerful because it's lined up with the state and capital. If you let them in, they will dominate you.
Okay.
And there's sort of an interesting point in there about the way, you know, you would think, okay, but we have to include these people because we need to rebuild the left, like, and the obsession with rebuilding the left as the purpose of socialism rather than advancing social interests is really distorting here as well, and would encourage you to bring in these right-wing folks who are going to pervert your movement.
One thing I just as a point of interest, it's not like Kautsky wanted to support the war. Am I correct in stating that?
That's true. Yeah, he just wanted things to. He wanted the socialist. He wanted the left to stay together. You know,
and he prioritized that over the split. Okay,
and it's that gives him the reputation for being pro-war, although he never was.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
So that's
interesting. I guess what gives him the reputation for being pro-war then is that Lenin today is not so much a thinker we rely on, but a puppet we stick our hand up the bottom of and say whatever political point we want.
Well, it's not hard to make Lenin say this, considering how he froths at the mouth about it. So,
are we specifically talking about fisting when we talk about this now? Are we fisting Lenin? Is that what's going on?
We're communists. We're talking about fisting as liberatory praxis.
There is some kind of like scary, like queer theory paper that makes this idea of like fisting as some kind of crazy metaphysical liberatory practice. This is all reminding me.
Zizek says that it's the most Edenic form of sexual congress.
I think he's like riffing off of something else that already exists, but
that's a shame.
In all matters pertaining to your question, Tom, I plead the fifth.
Did you say hedonic, or what word did you use there?
Edenic. Like
what the hell is that?
Adjective form of like the Garden of Eden.
Okay. Yeah. So like primal and I guess like sort of at the origins of humanity and sexuality.
It's more at the origins than PIV. Okay, whatever.
That would be that's an interesting.
I like it.
Interesting point to make. Yeah.
What the hell is PIV?
You know what PIV is, Tom?
I don't.
Come on.
All right. No. This is really fun. This is a good moment in left podcasting history. It means penis in vagina.
Oh my God! They actually abbreviated that. My God, seriously. But what is wrong with people under the age of 30? Like,
I guess it's just. I think it actually makes a good point.
They're having all this non-PIV sex. What the hell's the matter with them?
PIV.
I guess what I think the term comes out of is the fact that
I just want to know what HIV is.
I don't think it's as fun.
It's hand in vagina.
Yeah,
it's hand in vagina, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there we go. We're back to fisting, but I actually think the term PIV is good to denormalize the idea that that is the end all be all of every sexual encounter and things of that nature. I mean,
I quite agree. I'm going to read the first sentence of this section now.
You're not cutting any of this, by the way. Go on.
No, that wouldn't be right. It should be said right away that the positive claim of the right wing is true to the extent that we are willing to treat partial gains for particular groups of workers in Britain or workers in industry or in particular industries, etc., as gains for the working class as a whole. This does not, in fact, depend on the Workers' Party being a minority party and hence in need of formal coalitions. If the Workers' Party presents itself purely as a party of reform, it will also win members and voters from the existing parties of reform. And then slides into the description of the British Labour Party, which must seem all very hazy after all the fisting and PIV.
You just wanted to change the topic there. I didn't get anything good out of that. I'm joking.
You really think I don't want to talk about fisting?
I was really liking it. I was getting highly aroused. Let's just
I can loosen up your horizons.
Yeah. Down with PIV, I say. Okay. This point here, I think, is this.
Great, we did it. We did it.
We queered from alpha to omega, basically.
Yeah. It didn't take too much, let's be honest. Right. Yeah. Okay, so this point here.
Wait, before we move on, one more thing. If we're going to talk about this, I just want our viewers to know that if you've ever thought of switching teams for a celebrity, you're queer. Welcome to the club. Like, it's totally fine. You're in. No worries. Anyway, go on.
All right.
Switching team for a celebrity, like a particular celebrity, you'd say.
If there's a celeb that you would go homo for, then you have every right to claim queer identity.
Yeah, my friend John Butler. Oh, I should probably edit his name out. My friend, well, we are live. My friend used to always say that if he had to choose one, it'd always be Sean Connery. He said he liked Sean Connery, and it was very weird. Well, like Sean Connery was about 75 at the time. You're like going, of all the men in the world.
Does he mean like Bond Sean Connery or like Finding Forrester Sean Connery? We should move the fuck on.
I'm not exactly sure.
I love in Hunt for Red October, you know, some of these instruments are sensitive to bullets.
Did you say bullets or bollocks? Okay. Sorry. That's a bad joke. Now, so
read this whole paragraph, actually.
Sorry?
We should get into this whole paragraph that you have highlighted.
The reform policy is therefore a policy.
But the whole
I'll read. Let me read here. Okay. This is a good point, I think, that what gets to some people's disenfranchisement with the leftist, sock dem approach. The reform policy is therefore a policy for the growth and increase of power of the state and increased state taxation as a conservative press, and increased state taxation, as a conservative press puts it, for the nanny state. Okay, so and he goes on to say, the internal problem is that working class people are no more fond of being in perpetual parental leading reins from the state than the middle classes. The aim of emancipation of the working class is an aspiration to collective and individual freedom. Like, I think this is a major point. Like, that all of these like sock dems that have done good things in England and Scandinavia and all that, they still don't give you freedom. They still don't give you the sense of freedom that you were in control of your own life, of your production, of your working life. When it comes down to it, there's some redistribution, and you've got a bureaucracy you still got to deal with, and you don't have any sense of freedom in where you work and when you interact with the state. And usually they're oppressive bodies, and I think that's getting to something really real that's wrong with this right Marxist approach.
Amen.
Yeah. Grant, I imagine this tickles you quite a bit. And because, this is all about management. This is all about manipulation, or I don't know. There was a book that came out within like the last 10, 20 years by some behavioral economists called Nudge, where they talk about how to influence people's behavior, essentially without them knowing it, by arranging things. And it was almost like a nice way of being like a Foucauldian, like totalitarian. Yeah.
There's something really fundamental to Marxism in this problem. I agree with you, Tom, and I agree with you, Lexi, that there's something here about just this endless management of social antagonisms by the state, really. Just this endless deference of capitalism's social antagonisms to the nanny state. I mean, he says, it's a conservative point, but he concedes it nonetheless for a reason, I think. You know, I frankly think that this would apply on a larger scale in a way, is that you know, health changes don't register when you're only not drinking the big soda cup because it is banned. You know, and I think that that applies all the way to socialization policy.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting you mentioned that book Nudge, Lexi, because that was a real big one in Britain.
Yeah.
Here, the Tory party took it on, and it was like supposed to be the overriding philosophy of their approach to essentially, you know, cuts and stuff like that. You know, cutting of social, you know, so intrinsically they're into control. Then well, we'll get on to the negative claim. So here, what you call it, McNair talks about this concept of the nation state as essentially like being that it essentially plays a role like a firm in the world market, that each country is forced to essentially compete with other countries to gain access to surplus or whatever. So, and he kind of sums it up here. He says, to form a government within this framework, therefore, necessarily commits the participants to manage the interests of the nation state in global competition. And he goes on to mention about how basically, you know, in the developed world, it essentially leads to a kind of an imperialist attitude. Because when things go wrong, and if you're going to try and keep things good for your own workers, who's going to pay for it? And in essence, he says here, capitals are able to externalize the cost of downswing onto weaker states, and the firms, the landlords and petty producers, etc., associated with these states. Competition on the world market is thus military, political, economic. Like, it's very hard to deny that.
Yeah, he essentially calls this a predictive failure on the framework of the reformists. They don't fundamentally understand that the international state system is the bourgeois order. That would be the thing to overcome. And so by putting yourself in this framework, you're necessarily doing, you know, sectional working class politics, even if you represent the entire electoral majority 100%.
Like, it's interesting.
Go ahead, Tom.
I was just going to say, it's interesting to note, say, for example, an example of this at the moment in the UK was Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party were supposedly against Trident being renewed. That's the nuclear submarine thing. And, you know, it's like £1 trillion or something crazy they spend on it. And they ended up backing down on that. And it was like, it was like one of the first things that they had that actually really would go against the interests of the kind of imperial state. And, you know, they quietly did not go against that. And it's like, that's, you know, Jeremy Corbyn is as left as you can get in the Labour Party, and they still can't even get something like that in there. They can't denuclearize.
Right. I mean, it just, the political class internals of it, you know, you need approval to make certain like, you either need a social base, or the political class has to be willing to go along with it. And a lot of times the left tries to fix things with neither. But I wanted to quote something in the next paragraph. He's talking about the policy of reform. He says, the policy of reform through coalition governments thus entails A, the displacement of the downswing of the business cycle onto the weaker states and their firms and populations, and B, the displacement of the social polarization which capitalism produces onto polarization between nations. I think that B is something you see on the Stalinist, Maoist kind of left just constantly. That their whole the conflict between classes has essentially been replaced by the conflict between nations for these people.
Explicitly with Mao. For Mao, there's the proletarian nation. I want to continue the paragraph. On the one hand, this gives the reformists' negative claims their credibility. Reforms are actually achieved and social polarization is reduced in the successful states. On the other, the reformists necessarily commit themselves to sustaining and managing an imperial military force. Now, you can see where Lenin does have an impact on McNair's thinking. Like, even if Lenin ends up being inconsistent and builds, and I think your invocation of like, Stalinist and Maoist makes perfect sense. But of course, that's precisely the part of like Lenin's, Lenin's ideological children that is so disturbing, is that some of these trenchant critiques that McNair's getting that from Lenin and also from the Goethe program, of course. But yeah, in general, I don't know. I lost my train of thought.
Okay, so like definitely there is this, like if we look at the tendency within capitalism so far, before capitalism came along, the disparity between the wealth of the rich nations in the West, say go back to 1400 AD, and say a poor African country or a poor Asian country or South American, there was not much of a in distance. If we were to look at GDP per capita or whatever you wanted to measure it as, the life expectancy, the quality of life, maybe there was like a 2-to-1 ratio or something. But now it's like the GDP between, say, Botswana and the US is off the scale. It's probably nearly like 100-to-1 ratio, GDP per head. And we see that it's an inevitability of this kind of need to protect the home, to overexploit the far abroad. Or am I talking bullshit? What do people think about that?
I mean, that's, I guess what I was trying to get at towards the end of that is, yeah, a national framework commits you to the hierarchy of nation states. You want to be on the bottom, or do you not want to be on the bottom?
Let's not go down this fisting route again. This is going to get us in trouble. So this, I found, is an interesting character. Every so often in this, he'll throw in a bit of hardcore economics, which is kind of interesting.
Is Maoism
I'd like to read this paragraph.
Power bottoms? Okay, go on.
Oh dear. I've got many upsetting things I could say and I won't. Right. Learning slowly. I must have one of these, like, I have one of these Tourette syndromes where I must say the worst thing, but I'm getting it under control slowly.
Oh my God, whenever I go to a job interview, I just think of the most horrible things most socially unacceptable things that I could blurt out, and it's just grating against my brain the entire time. Stuff like that.
Yeah. It's going to be a tough one in the editing chair, folks.
There's no editing going on here. Okay.
Go on.
They absolutely do. In the same way, the global downswing must end in the destruction of the global money and property claims of the declining world hegemon state. Britain in 1914 to 45, the US at some point in the coming century. In its ultimately futile efforts to put off this result, the declining world hegemon state must respond by an increased exploitation of its financial claims and its military dominance, as Britain did in the late 19th century and as the US is doing now. That's kind of a kick-ass. Wait now. And then he goes on to say, the deferred and transposed business cycle can only overcome this problem by ending in war.
I'm curious if the United States is going to step up its military power during the 21st century, or if it's going to turn to increased isolationism. I think that's an interesting claim to make, that, like, and I think America's military dominance, I think that its power this century either way is going to rest on that, and that the United States, even as its economic power declines, is going to, barring some overthrow in the mode of production or what have you, that it could have a kind of steady decline because of its military power. But I think that would be a, keeping up with the latest technology, but less or more surgical interventions is what I think even the American political class, out of practicality, not the kindness of their hearts, may go for.
Yeah, like I'm skeptical of this claim that it has to end in war. Like, I know I've read some research on the Roman Empire when it split from the Byzantine wing and the Italian wing, say the Roman wing, that the Italian side just completely collapsed, but the Byzantine wing that kept going for ages, and
Yes.
they didn't collapse. This idea that it's inevitable they go to war, people can, you know, maybe
They're not capitalist states, though.
It's much more likely that there are, like, you know, there is a series of options, and one of them is this war. But it's hard to imagine the US, like the actual structure of the society is different now than it was in 1914. You've got nuclear bombs, you know, you can't go to war with your biggest enemy. It's just a no-no. No one can do it. So maybe they can screw up. But it seems much more likely to me is that what'll end up happening is slowly the US currency hegemony will drop, the dollar will drop, and they will be unable to support over time their military, and it'll end up just being scaled back. I think it's most likely.
I think Karl Kautsky has a theory. I believe it's Kautsky. Forgive me if it's not. Something along the lines of like hyper imperialism or something, where it kind of reminds me of like the globalization theorists around the 2000s. Basically, like, war is over. We've entered this era of economic cooperation between states, and that's how these conflicts will be deferred. It always struck me as an obvious ideological ploy, but hearing what everyone's saying here, I mean, it is likely that it's going to be harder and harder. Yeah, I mean, it's true. It's just true that it's harder and harder for the U.S. as an empire to put boots on the ground. But I don't think that means it's going to stop. It is less and less a way of managing.
Right, but it's about a change to surgical, precise kinds of intervention, and the need to appear like these interventions are apolitical and kind of limited.
I guess I'm going to say that's a symptom of the decadence of the empire, and they know how fragile things are. They don't want to do that obvious
I don't think there's that social solidity behind the capitalist states that would allow them to, like, you know, if they tried to do World War I again tomorrow, I don't think you could do it. I don't think you would have people signing up, and I think that has to
do the Iraq War tomorrow. You couldn't even do that.
Well, they're trying to Venezuela.
You a lemonade stand, for fuck's sake, let alone World War I.
Well, it's interesting. There's a great economist. He's a kind of a Marxian economist called Dr. Michael Hudson. I don't know if you guys know him. He's from that Kansas State University. He's a kind of he wrote a great book called Super Imperialism on America's dropping the gold standard. But he's been traveling around, like, to Russia, speaking in Russia and speaking in China and a lot of these places, talking about like how the US currency operates and talking to policymakers. And he's been saying, you know, we see the emergence in the last 5-10 years that the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians and a lot of these nations together are doing essentially barter deals, whereby Russia might give China a whole load of oil and gas, and China will say build them high-speed trains, and that they're not going through the dollar. And the actual amount of the percentage of transactions that are actually going on in the periphery and the dollar is dropping. And, you know, that's not saying that the dollar is going to hyperinflate or anything, but it's going to see a weakening on the dollar. And I think that he's got some excellent analysis there. But like, so I don't agree that it inevitably falls into war like it would have done in 1914. That's just inconceivable. Like the idea that like an Irish person will go to war with, like, you know, an Italian now is completely absurd. You know what I mean? It's even a British person and a German. That's absurd. Although
I think McNair's blind spot really often is mass politics and treating everything as if like mass politics commands the same social base that it did during the 20th century. Like, if you started out with McNair's revolutionary strategy in your hands in the 1950s, I think you would have a much better chance of building a workers' party out of it than you do today. You know, and I think that in general his perspective seems to uh, assume a solidity to the bourgeoisie's like control over people that is dynamic in
But
capitalism.
but I even think he misses some structural changes, like the idea of something silly like being able to go on holidays to Spain if you're in the UK, or to go to holidays to Germany. It changes people's idea of what a German or a Spanish person is. And it means that you can't have, like, people go on holidays
Right, yeah, no, but
in
I
Europe.
agree. I
They
think
literally
McNair
can't have. So a structural,
sorry.
but like even a structural change, like the ability for cheap air flight and for atom bombs, it structurally changes the pathways that history can take, that we can't just look back at 1914 and say, oh, this is what's going to happen. So I think there's a weakness in the book in that respect.
Yeah, it feels like we're kind of going through this, and I guess Revolutionary Strategy was written in 2008 or something like that. I feel like this was slightly less obvious then. But I feel like we are at the end of this. We're going through this long economic, technological, like shift where the political architecture is being undone, and I don't know that McNair sees that we are in a paradigm shifting moment. And it feels like, you know, the mistake of reading Revolutionary Strategy would be to try to redo the 20th century, but better.
Yeah, I think McNair, I think you're right about the substance of McNair's analysis more generally. I think for the task that he sets out for himself, that it's quite good to try to do this accumulated historical record. But
Oh, I
yeah,
think this is that's the thing. This is an incredibly valuable book, and like I said before, I think if you, and this is something Joe has said to me before, if you put this in the hands of somebody in the 1940s, 1950s, they would have had you might have you would be able to do something with McNairism in the mid 20th century much easier than you would now. But that again, that I would agree with you that this spectrum that he establishes in this chapter is helpful, and I guess I just see where in his analysis of nation states and all of that, this all starts to come out. I think with opinions about the United States. You know, if you think that World War III is going to happen because World War I happened, you know, if you don't,
I hear you. Yeah,
if you don't see that globalization happened, like Tom was saying, stuff like that.
Well, in my personal like interactions with McNair, which I think was one email exchange, he made a point of saying he knew nothing about the United States, and I don't think that's true, but I think what you're saying here bears out that that you can't really do induction about where the United States is going based on this, or Trump is going to throw us all for a loop and shit is going down. But anyway.
I was actually listening to a McNair lecture today when I was making some toast before we came on, and in it he mentioned this book. I thought I should mention it. It sounds like, well, let's just hear the title of this book. It's one of the greatest titles I've ever heard. It's by a guy called Jerry Toner, and it's called How to Manage Your Slaves by Marcus Sidonius Falks. I think I got to read that book and do a program on it. Apparently,
like useful reading material.
Fascinating.
But
as a leftist, one wonders which angle they're coming at.
It's weird because there's a foreword by this woman who's a professor called Mary Beard, and she does all these documentaries on the BBC. So I think it's kind of, I don't know. I think it's kind of, apparently McNair was saying, you know, you read it and you're kind of going, this just sounds like management school, which is really depressing.
Oh.
Anyway, moving on. Let's go on. Let's move on. The left's negative claim. Sorry, go on. What are you going to say?
Oh no, yeah, no. Speaking of things that make me want to do like an all. I had a good segue. It was something like, speaking of going all the fuck out against some crazy ass state shit. Let's go to the left and left Marxism and the strategy of the mass strike.
Absolutely. So this is the idea of, you know, what is associated with Luxembourg and the mass strike, and that in the revolutionary strike and the fervor of the working class, they will be able to burst through and grab control of the state, essentially, if I'm paraphrasing that correctly. Let's read this paragraph here. The proposal of the left. Sorry, go on. You're going to say something?
Probably it would be to smash the state. Actually, they would do this instead of doing any kind of government, like instead of like setting up a government, instead of taking control of the state. They do this in order to not be put in that position.
Well, here in this paragraph, though, we see the either demanding the transfer of political power to the working class. That's kind of,
but that
state power.
No, that doesn't mean keep the existing state in that for McNair doesn't mean keep the existing state together.
Okay, go on.
Let's read this paragraph. Okay. The proposal of the left was that the International could take the political initiative by extending the use of the strike weapon in support of the demands of the minimum program. As the working class was increasingly able to win victories by this weapon, its confidence and political self-assertiveness would grow, culminating perhaps in a general strike which challenged for power, either demanding the transfer of political power to the working class or, in the most Bakuninist form, immediately beginning the creation of the new society out of the free cooperation begun in the strike movement. Okay, it's weird, like the last sentence there strikes me as what Occupy tried to do. You know, you had your library in it, you had your health center, you had the food bit, it was like a model of society run on on some kind of a cooperative basis.
It is born from the struggle. You know, the necessary forms of organization emerge from the struggle. And not only do they emerge from the struggle, but for this last form here, we immediately begin the creation of the new society. Now, I do want to say, yeah, Bakunin thought a dictatorship of the proletariat was a bad idea. It would always end up a dictatorship over the proletariat, and that we got to skip straight to lower stage communism, like right now, basically. And some of the best Marxists alive today, at least in terms of like analysis, hold to something like this. Which is why I found McNair to be such a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, it seems to me kind of so obviously stupid that you couldn't practice beforehand. Like, why can't you build up structures within your society that will prepare people for when it happens, whether they're a party or other forms? But this idea that when it happens, then you'll have to figure it all out and there's going to be mayhem, it's going to all fucking not work and stuff. It just seems really, it seems to really fetishize the idea of revolution over planning and just straightforward organization. It just always strikes me as kind of stupid. Like, if you've got wrong organizational forms, as in the party and how it operated in the 20th century, it's like, try and fix that. Don't just try and hope for the best when something happens. It just
they do have a point that revolutions are incredibly chaotic and move behind the backs of actors, and very rarely in a revolution people execute a plan and this and that and the other. But a communist revolution would have to be fundamentally different from previous revolutions in ways that, you know, we can't be entirely sure of beforehand. So
yeah, you know, there is this. I think there is a fetishization of revolution. Like it just you know, it just baffles me. Anyway, so we're going to go on here to the left's negative and its positive claim. Let's have a look at what he says here.
yes,
The negative claim, relax there. The negative claim was that the method of electoral struggle and coalitions, or even the effort to build permanent mass workers' organizations, as opposed to ad hoc organizations of mass struggle like strike committees, necessarily led to corruption of the workers' representatives and organizations, and the evolution of these organizations into mere forms of capitalist control of the working class. The positive claim was that the method of the strike struggle could be extended and generalized. Experience has something to tell us about the value of these claims. Okay. So he's going to go in here and basically slate Lenin. Who wants to read this paragraph here that's going to slate the Leninist experience? Lexi, you've been doing it lately. Why don't you do it this time?
It's just right. I've lost friends over this, but yes. The negative claim may be on its face. The negative claim may, on its face, appear to be amply proved by the experience of the 20th century. It is certainly true of the policy of reform through coalition governments for the reasons given above. On the experience of the 20th century, it appears to be also true of the Leninist Party, quote, which claimed to escape it. Those communist parties which took power became corrupt apparatuses tyrannizing over the working classes of their countries, and most have ended in a return to capitalism, while most of the, quote, official CPs of the capitalist countries have become simple reformist parties of the kind advocated by the right wing of the Second International. The groups to their left have, to the same extent that they have attained mass support, gone down the same path, and to the extent that they have not, have in the main become fossilized sects. In either case, characterized internally by the petty dictatorship of the party bureaucracy. The trouble is that if the left's negative claim is taken seriously to be simply true, it is self-defeating. If any effort to organize outside strikes leads to corruption, nothing can be done until the masses move into a mass strike wave. Because to organize in any other situation would imply the struggle for reforms, including electoral activity, coalitions, and organizational forms which turn out to be corrupt. Unfortunately, however, as we will see in a moment, when a mass strike wave does break out, this in itself immediately poses the questions of government and forms of authority. So I went a little further, but I think this is worth putting out there. Tom, you might be surprised, or maybe nothing surprises you, to know that the first part of that second paragraph that I read, that there are nihilist communists that essentially they don't literally think we should do nothing, but they think so much of what the left does is is so counterproductive that they use "we should do nothing" as a slogan to discourage leftists from doing what they're going to do.
Yeah, like it's hard to argue that most of the stuff, well, not most, that's obviously wrong, that an awful lot of the stuff that the far left does is meaningless or negative.
Or worse, worse than
negative. Yeah, and I've had these arguments with people before I was ever politicized, and I think it's true. But yeah, let's have a look at what did he say in that now again? So like,
yeah,
let's get into that one about the Leninist Party there. You know that if you have a party form whereby once there is a crisis, it's so centralized that you can essentially cut down all political life forever in the country. That's a problem with organizational form, or a problem with the timing of when you've taken your revolution, that it leads to it. To me, that's just like pretty basic. Like, how come the Leninist parties that were, you know, the Bolsheviks that ended up in, how come 1970s Russia, how come they didn't allow, you know, political life? You know, World War II is over 30 years. What is it about it? They have the atom bomb. No one can invade them. What is it about them that they weren't able to go back? That's a pretty fundamental question.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, it's fair enough in the war, in a revolutionary war or a civil war, some stuff goes down, grand. But how come it happened in America after the Civil War and it didn't happen in Russia? You know, you've got 5,000, you've got 10,000 nuclear bombs. Nobody can come close to you. You know, it says something deeply fundamentally wrong with the political structure, and that's undeniable.
And while there's obviously too many differences between the American Civil War and the Russian Civil War to make a direct parallel, McNair does answer about the way Lincoln maintained democratic norms within the Union side. Of course, he was in war, so there was open conflict and repression of the enemy, but it's something Leninists could learn from.
I think one bit you would say is that it wasn't like once you won the war that you had a very different type of government than if you had lost the war. In some sense, they were both capitalist. It wasn't like there was another system trying to corrupt you.
It's complicated because we're talking about like the elimination of one of the major forms of ruling class in a government that was sort of like a compact between these two different kinds of ruling class.
But I mean, like, say for example, Thingy wins. The North wins in the American War, and they take control over the country. It's not like they are under enormous pressure from outside forces willing to put communism in there. You know, they win and everybody's capitalist and away you go. It's easier to, like a capitalist in the South, it's, you know, he's after the war, he's just want to go and make some money. It's not like there's like the Bolsheviks are in Canada waiting to invade on top of you.
You're quite right about that, but I can't resist bringing up that the United Kingdom almost intervened on the side of the South for, you know, a related reason. It's certainly not the same, but and that Marx and Engels, as part of the workers' movement at the time, helped shoot that down in the United Kingdom, and that might have turned the tide of the war. So good on the British workers' movement and on Marx and Engels for convincing their state to not intervene in the American Civil War.
It's ironic that the English workers' movement was run by some Germans. They're very organized, these Germans. Now, let's keep going. Nothing like a little bit of stereotyping nationalism.
Yeah, a little crowdery.
What's more crowdery than ethnic humor?
It's okay when it's Europeans. Well, that's all I know.
That's true. I was posting that I was going to watch Ireland smash the English in the rugby last weekend, but they inflicted a vast colonial massacre on us at the weekend in Dublin, which was very, very poorly taken. Let's go on to this next.
Thoughts and prayers. We stand with the oppressed nationality.
That's right. Up the IRA.
Up the IRA. Now, let me see. My granduncle was in the IRA. Now, he was. I'll tell you about that later. But okay, next paragraph.
Who wouldn't be proud though?
It's true. Okay, let's just keep going a little bit here. Under these conditions, the unorganized advocates of the mass strike as an alternative to permanent organization and the struggle for reforms are marginalized by the organized parties, like the Russian anarchists in the summer and autumn of 17, the anarchist CNT trade union confederation in the Spanish Revolution, the Bolivian Trotskyists in 51, and the Portuguese far left in 74 to 76. They will be driven to give support to some contender for governmental power and lose any political initiative. And I think that's fair. I just think that's fair.
Just fucking reality. Like what he's talking about with the CNT in the Spanish Revolution. I mean, if you ever look at the history, and I don't know if I've only looked at like distorted Marxist histories or something, but holy shit, there's a moment where like the previous like reigning Spanish government and the like one of the main belligerents in the Civil War is like, all right, anarchists, you can have this territory. We will hand you sovereignty. And they're like, no, we're not going to make a state. And then they end up having to, you know, participate in the bourgeois parliament. They had their moment. You know, they had like there was a point where the Spanish proletariat could have installed its class dictatorship. That could have happened there.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on it, but there's a lot of stuff went on there. You wonder, you know, a lot of the shenanigans was apparently done by they got all their backing from the Soviets, and they changed the nature of the revolution too. So you never know what's going on.
Yeah, the anarchists and Stalinists dropped the ball. What else is new?
Yeah,
but imagine, you know, that parallel universe everyone's always talking about, where, you know, I don't know. Imagine a parallel universe that sometimes people talk about, where, oh man, but if Lenin didn't happen, it would have been all bad for Europe in the 20th century. Well, what if there was no Stalinists to fuck up the Spanish Revolution? Anyway.
Yeah.
Right. There's lots of permutations, and it's clear that, you know, Lenin was one of the emancipatory figures of the 20th century, but the way that is paraded around and the way that is uncomplicated is just an excuse for people to promote their own politics, their own ideological horse shit.
But nonetheless, there is, I mean, you got to put something there, and as Tom's highlighting something. So
okay, yeah. So like, let's read this, but I find this particularly interesting, and I'll tell you why in a minute. The underlying problem is that authority is at bottom merely a means of collective decision making. To reject authority is therefore to reject collective decision making, and in the end, render yourself powerless. The existing social structures of authority then reassert themselves. In the end, anarchists have themselves discovered this in Joe Freeman's famous pamphlet, The Tyranny of Structurelessness. The Tyranny of Structurelessness. It happens just as much within small anarchists' organizations, the existing social structures of authority then being gender and class hierarchy, etc., as in mass workers' parties. Like, it's interesting. Like, I went to London when the Occupy happened, the first day it happened, and they went to St. Paul's Cathedral, and there was like 5,000 people there. And what actually happened was 5,000 people got there, right? They all sat down and they were like, all right, like, what are we going to do next? And then obviously, like, about 40 yards from me, there was like some of the like leaders, and they started to like set down how things would organize and talk and discuss, and it would like filter out. And then everybody just basically was kind of waiting for somebody to institute what was happening in New York. Some people were probably linked to the New York group. It happened, and then it went its way. But this idea that like there was no structure there completely was. Everybody just turned up, and we're all waiting for an authority, but it wasn't defined, and it just like emerged. And the entire structure of Occupy in London, it came specifically like as like nearly a directive from America. They all managed somehow randomly to totally have the exact same structures from all over the world. So there's obviously structure happening, but it's not. It's like it's not a designated official structure. So I think this is a very good point.
Well, it goes to show too that so many left scenes, you know, these anti-hierarchical, anti-organizational scenes become ruled by punk scene. You know, you're at the end of the day, you're now subject to the whims of this other thing, and it's
right. Yeah, you just get a lot of star fuckers, and it's a dictatorship of the most sociable. It's like the rest of capitalist society. Go figure.
Right. It's a kind of like weird inversion. I mean, Lexi, I think that we could actually. I know you've been critical of this wordplay before, but I think maybe from that angle we can we can maybe write something about politics without the state and anarchism. Because I know Joe has said that before.
Sure, whatever. What I do want to say here, what I want to say here though is that just as an asterisk, Joe Freeman is one of the best theorists and historians of the radical feminist movement. If you have never read anything by Joe Freeman, certainly read The Tyranny of Structurelessness, but don't stop there.
Is
anyway,
Joe a woman or a man?
A woman. I ran into The Tyranny of Structurelessness during Occupy, and it was the most fucking obvious thing ever. It was laying out there the intuitive reasons why I could never really consider myself an anarchist for more than a week, even though I had a lot of libertarian and autonomist intuitions and commitments, and continue to. There is a very obvious set of social dynamics that pop up if you are a scientific socialist. Be an anthropologist, be a sociologist, be a small group sociologist, and be fucking honest. This is what happens.
Yeah. Let's just read.
Delegated social power that is actually accountable, that admits it for what itself, to what it is,
I remember I thought, I thought that there really wasn't a structure. And I was talking to someone that actually helped put it together, I later learned. And so I was sitting there going, wow, gee whiz, isn't this amazing? There's no leaders, and it's like, no leaders. They're like, they're like, take a look around, see who the leaders are. Just don't listen, like look at who is actually leading things. And I don't know. I don't know. I don't know where my development went wrong, where somebody had to say that to me. You know what I mean? But like, it is truly the most obvious thing in the world, and you need to be ideologically blocked to not see it.
It was that day when you asked your parents for a slice of cake and they said no.
That's right. That's where it all went wrong.
That's how it starts. This paragraph here, this little section, to me is kind of, for me, a massive critique of the book. Okay, so the almost uniform failure by processes of bureaucratization and corruption of workers and socialist parties, big and small, tells us that we have not solved the problem of what sort of authority, that is, what sort of mechanisms of decision-making will serve the interests of the working class. And he goes on to say, it also tells us that this is an absolutely urgent to do so, and that the standard Trotskyist response originated by Trotsky himself that the party regime is not a political question is profoundly false. The party regime is inevitably the image of the sort of regime we are fighting for. So like, this to me is like, it's like a kind of a throwaway paragraph in the entire book. But the book does absolutely nothing to deal with how you would go about designing a party. It's, the book is a critique of history, yet, if you come from the Leninist tradition, Mike McNair is coming out of the CPGB, and what should be a massive glaring fault with all of left politics of the 20th century should be this problem. But I find it ironic that apart from this one paragraph, I don't think there's another thing said in the entire book on this issue.
He does say something in parallel about the councilists. And I think, Tom, you're quite right. It's funny, the big councilist, Anton Pannekoek, and Leon Trotsky both have a quote that says something along the lines of, we have no models. All we have is a history of what doesn't work, essentially. Which is a funny thing for either of them to say, because both of them did have things that they thought were the right way of organizing things. Pannekoek ended up fixated on workers' councils as being the correct form, and that's in the context that McNair criticizes him. But he does say that Pannekoek was asking the correct question.
Yeah, and I think as leftists, it doesn't take you that too long to understand. I feel like, looking at the 20th century, that's something that needs to be where we put an awful lot of our emphasis in. You know, we understand the falling rate of profit at this stage. You know, how's about like experimenting with party design? It seems like quite a you know, a kind of a critical issue that I think is largely left. People either just reject the party form in its entirety, or they just stick to it blind.
Right, right.
Yeah, there's a sociological blockage here. I don't think it's impossible to think this through and to do something different. I just think we consistently get the wrong kind of nerds for something like that.
Okay. Let's go on to the left's positive claim. So this is the idea that, like, you know, you could shut down the country and take power with the strike. Let's have a look. Here's his criticism of it. It should at once be apparent that this cannot continue for more than a few days. If the result is not to be general catastrophe, the workers need not simply to withdraw their labour, but to organise positively to take over the capitalist facilities and run them in the interests of the working class. A truly all-out indefinite general strike, therefore, immediately demands the effective de facto expropriation of the capitalists. Sorry, somebody's making a noise. As a result, it at once poses the question, will the state protect the capitalist property rights? In other words, it poses the question of political power. So, like, that's pretty, I think that's pretty self-evident.
Yeah.
We'll go on. Let me just read the next paragraph, because it's all of an argument. Now, of course, what the advocates of the mass strike strategy were calling for was not such a truly all-out indefinite general strike called by the political party. The reality of mass strike movements is something a great deal more messy, of the sort described for Russia in Luxembourg's the mass strike, but seen since then in many different countries at different times. The political regime falls into crisis. Some spark sets off the mass movement. Rather than a single planned, truly all-out, indefinite general strike, there is a wave of mass strikes. Some protest actions for political demands, some partial struggles for economic demands. They begin to overlap and accompanied by political radicalization. Okay. But a movement of this sort still poses the general question of political power, and for exactly the same reasons. A mass strike wave disrupts normal supply chains. This can be true even of a strike in a single industry like the miners' strikes in Britain in 72 and 74. Equally, however, the capitalist property rights are from their point of view not merely rights to things, but rights of streams of income, which can be made to flow from the social relations which ownership of these things represents. The strike, therefore, is in itself an interference with their property, and a mass strike wave threatens the security of their property. They begin to disinvest and to press the state for stronger action against strikers. So, Jesus, I hate reading the whole feckin' thing, but let me read this one last bit. It is a long bit, but let's just read it. A strike wave or revolutionary crisis can last longer than a truly all-out indefinite general strike, but it cannot last longer than a period of months, at most a couple of years. In this situation, if the workers' movement does not offer an alternative form of authority, alternative means of decision-making, which are capable of running the economy, the existing social structures of authority are necessarily reaffirmed. Yeah. So, like, I think that's just common sense. You know, look what happened in look what happened in the Egyptian revolution. You know, the whole country was up for that revolution, and it was like, it was on the streets, and it was a long period of disarray. And what happened in the end? It was so dysfunctional. The left was so unorganized and so weak that it couldn't get control of that revolution, and it just petered itself out because people actually found it more disruptive than the old regime. And what's going to happen? You're going to end up with, you know, the old regime again, essentially.
Yeah, well, look at I love what it says right after. God help me for reading more. But either the military moves in, like in Spain, in 1873 through 4 and 1936, etc., or the reformists put in power, reestablish capitalist order. The German government in 1918, everywhere in Europe in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Yeah. I don't know what to say about this. I find this to be very obvious, and anyone that's ever looked at the long run of political power, or even just in interpersonal dynamics, what a vacuum looks like, a power vacuum looks like, like, I don't know. I don't know, man. What are we doing fucking around with people that can't, that can't envision that this is our prime problem?
I really do think that McNair is right that state power is asserts itself as a question. But I think that the whole fundamental framework here, if you come at it from the perspective of, there's just something about the framing here where it feels like, since it's about the left and about political power, like, McNair can't see necessarily the use of what the difference would be between, like, what the use of a strike. Cut this. I have to write about this. Just cut what I just said.
Well, he will take Kautsky's line, essentially, that, autonomous action of this kind is ultimately ultimately unnecessary, that you don't actually need like extended general strikes, because
that's what I was. I
right.
stopped talking because I didn't want to accuse McNair of saying that there was no use to proletarian social activity. But I guess if he does say that, then that's that. Because I think that even
I don't know about proletarian activity in general, but I don't know about proletarian activity in general, but certainly in these indefinite sort of general strike strategies,
or any economic kind of revolt or uprising, right? Like I think that there's
he's not opposed to strikes. He's not opposed to strikes, but these sort of like mass strike. Mass strike is a strategy, right? I don't think he's opposed to popular, protest tactics. It's not what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's not it's division of it from tactic to strategy, whereas this is like it seems to be fetishized as a strategy. And I think the Kautskys would say that this is just a tactic that can be used in particular circumstances, but this is not going to lead us to communism. This is not communism.
Right. I suppose I'm just thinking that I see a lot of people today who will kind of look at this stuff and immediately be like, okay, this is like, who will look at any kind of activity and think like, this is pre-political, this needs to be like shaped. And I think that gets you to like Syriza more than it gets you to a workers' party.
Yeah.
I don't know. We can
go on. Yeah, let's keep going. What about this? All power to the Soviets. Okay. So Lenin, he makes out believe that this was like the way around this problem. You get the Soviets and they take power after the mass strike. But he goes on to critique this. Okay, in this paragraph here, he thinks that it was an illusion. He says almost as soon as the Bolsheviks had taken power, they were forced to move from a militia to a regular army, and with it came logistics and the need for a state bureaucracy. The Soviets and militia could not form the core social function of the state, defending the society against external attack. The problem of authority over the state bureaucracy was unsolved. Lenin and the Bolsheviks fell back on the forms of authority in their party, and as these proved a problem in the Civil War, almost unthinkingly militarized their party and created a corrupt bureaucratic regime. I think there's a lot packed into that goddamn paragraph there. As in
that unthinkingly is biting. Like
yeah.
But it's true.
You think it's true?
Well, it's a shame because they smashed the state in a way. They implemented something that kind of they really did get rid of a form of order and then basically built it back up. It's so maddening. Like when people say there's a common structuralist claim that, you know, Lenin did not truly smash the state. But I think there's a vital sense in that he really did get rid of, like, forms of authority that were there. And the tragedy is that because I still don't know how to qualify this exactly, but how, no matter how sincere he is about replacing all these forms of authority with, like, you know, communes and or I'm sorry, Soviets, and like this idea of like a commune state of some kind, like it doesn't work, and so he falls back on basically recreating something that is like the Tsarist state, like the militarist state. It is almost like he didn't smash the state, even though he kind of did. Like, it's sort of maddening.
He smashed the existing one. He smashed the existing one and then just put it together a new one.
But is it that he? Here's what it doesn't seem. Here's what I want to say, but I feel like is naive. That, you know, he just, you know, thought that this would work out, and so when it didn't work out, he just panicked and did the, you know, and did the bureaucratization thing, and it was like an accident. But he's a pretty smart guy, you know what I mean? Like, did he really do this and just got sad that it didn't work out, or was this a cynical move? I still chewing on that.
Well, like, I think the thing is that even if you never know what some of these motives are, that's the thing. You can only look at, do you think what they did worked or not? That's the way I approach it. You know, we'll never know in Lenin's brain. Some people think Lenin, some people who I would trust in the left think Lenin is an asshole, and some think that, you know, he wasn't an asshole. So, like, if people are that split on the idea, you can only look at someone's actions and critique the outcomes of their actions. So what this kind of leads us to believe, either that there was something wrong with the society at that point in Russia, that you couldn't have done it, you know, that it couldn't have worked, or that essentially, you know, maybe Lenin and those guys were nefarious. You know, I don't think there's too many other things you can come to terms with.
Well, there was opposite. Yeah, I mean, you have to look at the range of opposition to Lenin within the Bolshevik Party itself as well. You have to do that separation of the social forces in the Russian Revolution and their representation in the Bolsheviks, and I think that there is a results-driven way of looking at this that tells us a lot, but also that if Lenin and the Bolsheviks had their German Revolution and we had Red Eurasia, I think that a lot of the smart Marxists would have been looking at that edifice as something that needed to go at some point too. Like, it would very quickly run into some of the same problems. You know, maybe it's an interesting question. It's something that Joe and I have chat about a lot. And how to feel about Lenin, how to feel about the Bolsheviks, I think, is a question any thinking communist asks themselves pretty sincerely, and doesn't have like an uncomplicated answer to. Right.
Although we do have to, how to feel about Lenin is one thing, but how to think about Lenin, you know, how do we deal with this? Because recently, one of the things I've been doing is not just looking at the oppositional elements within the Bolsheviks, but looking towards some of the Mensheviks that were loyal to the revolution. And there weren't, you know, that many. A lot of Mensheviks ended up joining the White Army and, you know, were disgraces to international socialism. But Julius Martov, the opposition leader in the Soviet regime, has a great pamphlet from 1919 called The Ideology of Sovietism, that when I read it, I get more McNair like vibes from Martov than I do from Kautsky, because Martov is for he's not initially for October, but once it happens, he accepts it as a historical fact and tries to make it as democratic as possible. Anyway, I think I made a mistake earlier by conflating the commune state with the Soviet regime, and McNair makes a good point that, you know, to blur the lines between the Paris Commune and the Soviets even before the militarization and displacement of Soviet power is still like an ideological blurring.
Yeah, I don't think the Soviets really implemented sort of the commune form, and you can ask how much they could have, but
right.
Let's have a look at this paragraph here then. Subsequent history confirms this judgment. Workers' councils in similar forms have appeared in many strike waves and revolutionary crises since 1917. In none have these forms been able to offer an alternative centre of authority as alternative decision-making mechanism for the whole of society. This role is unavoidably played by a government, either based on the surviving military bureaucratic state core or on the existing organisations of the workers' movement. I think that's quite an important thing. Like, you know,
yeah.
Even you go to Argentina in 2000 when they had their currency crisis and everything fell apart. You had workers' councils spring up all over the place, taking over the factories, and they withered away. And who did it lead to? It led to the what was the husband and wife couple called that ruled Argentina 10, 15 years? I can't remember their names now.
I can't
Somebody
remember
in the chat will probably tell me. But like they a kind of general lefty kind of political party organization came through, and not workers' councils, which means it tells you something. It tells you that, imagine that we were working in Amazon or something.
Perón?
Yeah, I was going to ask, were you talking
Perón,
about like Ava and what?
No, not the Perons. They were in the 50s. Argentina presidents. Okay.
The example I was thinking of was the Iranian Revolution that ends up with the Ayatollah. But there's fucking workers' councils in the Iranian Revolution.
Yeah, loads of them. It was a lefty one. You see, here they are. Is it the Kirchners? So the Kirchners were presidents from 2013 to 2003 to 2015. And I think did they have something like 6 presidents in a week or something at one stage? But it's so I imagine we were working for Google or Amazon or something, and they wanted us to figure out how to organize, operating this type of business and what structures we'd have, like what they would get rid of. They would, after it didn't work for however so long, they've done it. Well, look, we've tried workers' councils 26 times in different revolutions. Yeah, they haven't worked. What will we try now? We'll try this week. Oh, let's try workers' councils again. It's like, you'd lose your job. You get sacked. No capitalist works on that. So we should be looking. We should be using similar type of fucking evidence-based approaches. God Almighty, that we have to say such things is incredible.
It is. But I think a lot of people have an understandable fixation on workers' councils because that was the promise to solve this organizational question, to solve the problem of the workers' state, quote unquote.
Yeah, like if we think about society, like I keep getting back to this kind of point when we're talking about this stuff, that we need all these different approaches. Like we need democracy in the workplace, but maybe we need other structures for activating and controlling political authority in a revolutionary strategy. You need both. They're both complementary. They both have separate uses. We should be thinking about organizational structures that are relevant to the actual task at hand. They can all be left ones, and we should be using them for purpose and not out of some kind of loyalty to a particular bureaucratic form. It's kind of incredible you could have a loyalty to bureaucratic form over and above like actually winning and ending up in the communist society.
Yeah. That last point in the paragraph we had read, the role of the decision-making mechanism for the whole society is unavoidably played by a government either based on the surviving military bureaucratic state core or on the existing organizations of the workers' movement. I think that's really the heart of Marxism. I think that's the heart of revolutionary Marxism. Like, it's hard to imagine what an alternative, like, what it's hard. It is hard to imagine the alternative. And if you don't think it can be the existing state core, then the fact that there's no, like that there's an incredibly weak workers' movement, and for the standards of the 20th century, at least in the United States, no workers' movement, you know what I mean, is there's a reason why when, these forms kind of fell out and all of the, organized like trade unions and social democratic parties and Leninist states, when they all kind of like got like hit at once, people stopped taking communism seriously, is because there's no more there's no more real like feasible way to imagine a transition to an alternate state form, like without those existing institutions there, or an alternate power center, even if you don't want to call it a state, whatever the fuck, you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, that's the thing is McNair acknowledges that, whatever you're going to call it, you have to deal with the question of the social totality in a revolution pretty much right away. That's that, but that, I would say also taking state power is not enough, and that there are complications about what it means to take state power, to conquer state power, that sort of thing. But I think McNair, and something that I was always attracted to about this work, in contrast to more anarchist or left on McNair's spectrum thought, is that McNair just says like power is an important question. And even having gone through anti-political kind of development in my thought since the first time I sat down with revolutionary strategy, I still think his emphasis on politics being the problematic is really useful, and the fact that state power is a big exclamation point question, and you can't avoid it.
Yeah, I think it's obviously a major problem. I think this book, really just deals kind of with that problem more than anything. Am I right in saying that?
Oh, quite right. I mean, this is the metric that he's going to be using throughout the whole book, for explaining the different, I don't know, for identifying where these other strategic or tactical turns are coming from, and why people make this move or that move, what selecting one of these strategies binds you to. And alternately, for the center, the one that he actually advocates, he advocates, he wants to talk about, the problems with what, the vagaries of that kind of position. Like the entire book is built off of this strategic, like, Triforce, or I forget what the what people usually say here. Trifecta. Yeah, I'm going with Triforce though. Dun 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 dun.
Triforce. Yeah. Like, to me, like, I was just thinking, like, the book shouldn't be called Revolutionary Strategy. It should be called Revolutionary Political Strategy.
Right.
It doesn't deal with the social element at all, really. It's nearly entirely at the party level that he's dealing with.
Yeah, but I
like party strategy as opposed to like social strategy as well.
Right, and if you actually want to rebuild, if you actually want communism, well, socialism does need to be organized, and we shouldn't be abstentionists, but socialism does come from social interests and relations. And people are always asking themselves, like, what would Lenin do? And not, posing the question to themselves socially to realize that millions of people were posing the question to themselves socially for Lenin to have an opportunity to do anything, to kind of it there is a very externalizing quality to um, avoiding the question of the social.
I think the reason that he doesn't go into the social and that he's talking so much about politics and that's his strategic focus is what he was getting at when he was saying, well, what should socialists do when the class isn't moving? Because I'm going to tell you this right now, like this podcast, not likely to spark the rev, right? Like, I don't know what.
Shut up.
All right, cut
Patreon money.
Lexi's feed. Cut Lexi's feed.
I don't know what
that Patreon money. The fucking revolution's coming. I'm going to be able to buy Bitcoin. I'm going to be able to get myself some like Chinese workers. It's going to be brilliant, lads.
Well, so the point being that political forms is something that Marxists can do and think about and work out and study and try to get a grip on and prefiguratively deploy within our little weird circles if we have a big enough one that necessitates it, and try to figure out how to do this. And I know that sounds laughably naive for the nihilist communist reason that so much of what is done there is terrifying, like truly on the bottom of the barrel of organizational forms with throughout society more generally. You tend to get more democratic stuff out of like Silicon Valley tech companies or startups and shit like that. Like it's truly it's insane. But it is something that the intelligentsia who are sitting around reading books about this can plausibly do, where again, I'm sympathetic to people that want a base build, but I'm the wrong kind of nerd for that. And I think most Marxists aren't really lined up for that. That I know.
So essentially what you're saying, Lexi, is that you're an Owenite. Is that it?
An Owenite.
You want to create your own socialist commune, maybe in the sticks in Arkansas.
Oh yeah. You know me. I love nature. I love the woods.
Do your permaculture. Do your permaculture, yeah. And then smelt metal and make your own guns. Yeah, it'd be great.
All right, you know what? You're convincing me. That sounds pretty badass. But McNair's making the point that there is a prefigurative element to this. It's drawing on the utopians isn't totally, silly. Like the prefigurative element to the future, like worker state or whatever, is figuring out like democratic decision making now. And if there is something like a Marxist center that pops up, you know what I mean? Like, how would you run that actually democratically? And to their credit, I think they are probably working through these sorts of things in a way, but I don't think they're as clear on the fact that their task is probably primarily like a political task. Like they have to figure out a way of making like an organization that's like durable, but also could be the kind of thing that would, deserve to be inherited by an autonomous movement that pops up. I don't know. I don't necessarily say that stuff as say, oh, they're not worth it, but they're oriented in a different direction. They're oriented towards trying to spark a social activity and trying to get people together, which I understand, but is, I guess, not where my intuitions lie.
Likewise, really.
Grant, do you want to read that paragraph that you're salivating over?
I did like what McNair does here, because it's not something his acolytes would ever do. But quote, I do not mean by this to glorify the bureaucratic outcomes of the dictatorship of the revolutionary, in square quotes, party, either in Russia or in Cuba. The point is simply that the problem of decision-making authority is not solved by the creation of workers' councils arising out of a mass strike movement. Hence, the problem of institutional forms which will make authority answerable to the masses needs to be addressed in some way other than fetishism of the mass strike and the workers' councils. So he just the very fact alone that he puts the word revolutionary in scare quotes before party, either in Russia or in Cuba. You know, this is really, to me, radical stuff. To make that delineation between the social forces and the revolutionary party, and to not conflate party and class the way I think a lot of leftists do, even if you are for a party, and I certainly am. You know, but at the same time, I think that something we've been hitting on this discussion is that the old forms are dead in a certain way, and I think a new party would look new. I don't, you know, that's kind of mysticism to say, but at the same time, I think it's true. I think that there's something withered about the old forms that we would have to do something differently, and we couldn't have these like nationally delineated same kind of structures that we had in the Second International and things like that. I just think it's going to look a little different. If once worker activity returns, I think we can't just do a replay.
Okay, let's bring her on home.
Yeah, let's bring it on home. Last paragraph. I think this wraps it up nicely. Who wants to take this? Will I read it, or do you want to read it, Lexi? You read it.
I'm gonna roll out with this one. This is a great paragraph. We should also have seen that the problem with both strategies centers on the questions of government as a central coordinating authority, and the role and structural forms of the bureaucratic coercive state. The right sought to form governments based on that existing state. The left adopted a strategy which, at the end of the day, evaded the whole problem of state authority. In truth, these issues, originally debated between the 1870s and 1900s, are live, unresolved questions in today's politics. In the next chapter, we will see what, if anything, the center tendency in the Second International, led by Karl Kautsky, has to teach us on these issues.
Well, I think that tells us, I think that's wrapped it up. Let's say, will we just say, call out a few people in the chat before we go? I think that's a good place to finish. We're going 2 hours. Grant's weak at the knees, barely surviving, blood dripping from his jowls.
I know. I had some like half point I made that I really wanted to fully articulate earlier, but I just have this. Yeah, I did see some really interesting comments, though. I think it's worth going through.
Yeah.
Well, we'll just give a shout out the names because it's too long and arduous to go.
It is too long. You're right.
Yeah.
So we got Jake P. We got Man of Steel podcast. I think that's a Stalin podcast. I don't know. Erica Wheeler, Michael Johnson, Jake P. Trans Revolution. That's Sophie from previous episodes. Michael Johnson. Who else do we have? Jara Handala, a regular. Our most favorite LDS KJFHFL KJDH FLKJ DHF, a stalwart. Anybody else in here? Marshall Villager, I like that name. And I think that's about it. Anybody else we see? Oh, Nai F8. There's another one.
Nai F8. Did we get Erica?
Erica, yeah, I got Erica.
Good. Dylan.
And Stephen De La Corso, Martinus Augst, another regular. There we go. Thanks everybody for coming on. Do you guys want to say anything before we go dead?
Glad we got through that whole chapter. in just 2 hours.
You did well.
We did well.
I think it's easier when there's less of us, to be honest. I think 3 or 4, 5 is a max. Anything, even 5, anything above 4 gets kind of unwieldy.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yeah.
we're all what do you call it, self-important idiots, and we all want to, expound for ages.
The word is podcaster, Tom.
That's it. My point is more important than everybody else's, and I must say it. Oh, dude, that's the joy of actually having your own podcast.
Oh yeah.
You can get to say everything you want all the time.
Yes. I recommend it.
Well, there's people here actually talking about anti-politics that I don't know, and they're talking about calling things anti-political. I feel like I should network with these people. Anyway, let's go.
Let's go.
This was great.
Thanks everybody for coming. We'll say a group goodbye. Goodbye.
Yes. Goodbye.
Grant, are you not going to say goodbye?
Yeah.
I'm not going to say goodbye. I'm flouting social conventions.
It's an Irish goodbye.
He's above it. He's above it. Imperial.